Good evening. I'll be talking today about the osteoporosis medical management. In the last lecture, we covered a part of the diagnosis and establishing what osteoporosis is and how we can diagnose it. Just to quickly recapitulate those two parts, we studied that bone density or DEXA is the gold standard, and the osteoporosis as established by WHO is less than minus 2.5 on the DEXA of a T-score. The T-score should be less than minus 2.5. So, and we also sort of understood who should undergo bone density. So there were criteria for them that above 60 females and all should go. And then there are high risk patients also who are on steroids, who have multiple medications which can cause osteoporosis. They may undergo early. We read about the T-score as well as the Z-score and how to quantify this as central measurement and peripheral measurement. And there are other determinants to bone strength, which are just not those numbers of DEXA, but the type of bone, the porosity, and other things also. And where there are implants and all, we cannot rely alone on DEXA. We have to take the clinical measurements into consideration. We also read about the QCT or the qualitative CT and the FRAX, which is the fracture risk assessment tool, in which you have a calculator to give a probability of hip fracture and probability of major osteoporotic fractures. And medical indications are there. If the probability of hip fracture is more than 3% or major osteoporotic fracture more than 20%, we have to start medical management. In the investigations, we did know about the vitamin D and calcium test. We read about the albumin correction, that whenever you do a non-ionized calcium, you should have an albumin to correct it. And do not specifically write that do not put tourniquet and do not tap the vein while drawing the sample. There are advanced lab investigations which we sometimes rely on understanding the medical treatment for the osteoporosis. The main important one of these are the P1NP or the amino terminal propeptide of type 1 collagen, and this CTX, or also called as beta cross labs also, which are there available. So NTX in urine can also be checked. It has to be a 24-hour urine. It is better, but because it is cumbersome, we rely on these ones. So there are bone formation markers and there are bone resorption markers. So bone formation markers, apart from the other ones like alkaline phosphatase and all of this, the P1NP is the one which we rely primarily for the anabolic activity. And CTX or the C-telopeptide of collagen cross-link is the one which we rely in blood for the catabolic activity. So non-pharmacological intervention has to be started at an early age. So all the young people, you have to educate about the daily exercise, brisk walking, weight-bearing exercises, adequate calcium and keeping vitamin D optimal, and avoiding alcohol and smoking. So this is the non-pharmacological management, which in general we have to educate the masses about. And then comes the medical management. So based on these medical managements, there were two types of osteoporosis, the primary and the secondary. The primary one is type 1 or the post-menopausal osteoporosis. Maximum drugs, maximum studies have been done for this post-menopausal osteoporosis. It's the hallmark of osteoporosis, and then things are applied from here to other branches. The senile osteoporosis is again similar and something like secondary osteoporosis, which is most commonly because of steroids, and that is what is called as GIOP, glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis. So whenever we talk about drugs, these are the three situations where we need to consider them: a postmenopausal situation, a senile situation, and a drug situation like a GIOP. So let's understand these situations, how they are different. So let's see, when a patient is young, compare that bone stock to a sort of a water tank, which is filled with water. Now there is a good inflow, which is bone formation is good, and there is a outflow, which is bone catabolism is also there. So the net gain is towards plus. But what happens is that if you have a situation like this and you have to treat osteoporosis where the outflow is major, if you block this outflow, you will be able to fill up the tank. So, which means that if you give anti-resorptives in this situation, you may be able to improve the bone density better. Then there is a low turnover situation where the bone form, which happens in elderly above 70 and all, where the bone formation is very poor and the bone loss is also very less and the overall tank is empty. Now here, if you decide to plug it, that drop is not going to fill up the tank. So you need something which can improve the bone formation, which is sort of anabolic, teriparatide, and which will fill up this tank. So that is where the anabolic thing comes. And then later on, you can plug this tap by an anti-resorptive to sort of prevent the water loss. And that is the whole theory of giving teriparatide, that you fill up the tank and then teriparatide needs to be followed up by an anti-resorptive like a bisphosphonate or a denosumab to block that thing from getting worse again. If you stop teriparatide after giving 24 months, within 8, 9, 10 months, the whole effect gets washed away. It's all waste. That whole 2 years, sort of pain and trouble which the patient took will become absolutely waste. So based on these two scenarios, we have two types of drugs, anti-resorptive as well as anabolic. So anti-resorptives will primarily act best in this type of situation where there is osteoporosis post-menopausal when the bone loss is there, or a secondary osteoporosis. Whereas teriparatide is best acting in this senile osteoporosis situation when the bone formation is very less. So anti-resorptives, there's a huge list of anti-resorptives. We are going to discuss the main drugs. Let's discuss first about the calcium and the vitamin D. So there is a recommended dietary allowance of calcium, but as a general rule, you remember in the 19 to 50 age, around 1000 is the what is required, and it increases slightly as in the females as they come across the menopausal area and thereafter everything. So the aim should be to encourage them to take natural sources of vitamin D and not the tablets and all, because naturals are the one which will cause less side effects. There are some studies which have demonstrated that high calcium intake has been linked to cerebrovascular accidents, strokes, and all of these heart diseases and all. So that is what we need to be careful about. So there are two types of calcium formulations, which are the basic tricalcium phosphate as well as the calcium citrate maleate. The ones which are best are the calcium citrate one, because they don't need acidic environment to dissociate. So you can take them anytime. They are independent of the food. Whereas if you take a calcium carbonate, you need to take it 2-3 hours after dinner, and then you don't take anything. Otherwise, it will not get absorbed. Patients who are on PPIs and sort of antacids, they also interfere in calcium absorption. Do not give more than 500 milligram of elemental calcium at one time. So if a patient has to take 2 tablets of calcium carbonate, so don't give both together because they will not get absorbed. It's above the intestinal threshold for absorption. You need to give it separately, morning, evening. And the another advantage which citrate had is that it prevents urinary calcium oxalate crystal formation and the urinary stones also. So vitamin D, we all are deficient, and people ask us questions about sunlight and all. So if you are looking for sunlight, you need to be exposed to sunlight for 10 to 15 minutes with your 40% of body area exposed between 11 to 2 p.m. You don't think that 9 o'clock morning sunlight will give you enough vitamin D. It will not be able to form. Another question which is very important is that is injectable vitamin D better? The answer is that it sort of attains the peak later on. So it has a sustained effect. So this is a very important diagram which shows that if you give 6 lakh units per oral, the peak is attained much early than injectable. The injectable has a sustained effect, so it will have a sustained effect later on, and then it drops down also suddenly. Whereas oral is much better in sort of replenishing the vitamin D levels. And weekly doses are better because they sort of slowly sustain the levels. Do not give 3 or 6 injections. That's not recommended. 1 injection is enough to be given for 6 months at least. You repeat the levels and then decide if you want to repeat the injection and all. But at one time, do not prescribe 3 or 6 injections. And again, combining injectables and oral is something which is not recommended. Activated vitamin D should not be used. It has a very specific role. It is given only when there are renal sort of challenges and the patient is having very high PTH to suppress it, or very specific situations. They can cause renal stones and heart calcification. So avoid formulations which have calcitriol unless it is indicated. The maintenance therapy should also be given around 1000 to 2000 international units a day once the patient has attained the normal levels of vitamin D. So there is another anti-resorptive, which is calcitonin, which comes as nasal spray. So it is not recommended to use for osteoporosis. It is just meant to sort of decrease the calcium levels in, sorry, decrease the calcium levels in a patient who has multiple metastases or recumbency. So it prevents acute bone loss in those situations, and it's salmon calcitonin. So what happens is after sustained use, antibodies start forming against it and it becomes ineffective. So it is not recommended to go beyond 3 months, and it is not recommended as a osteoporotic treatment. It has got specific indications to prevent acute sort of decalcification because of recumbency, metastasis, or a patient presenting to you with hypercalcemia. You can give calcitonin to sort of decrease the calcium levels. Then comes the major drug, which is the bisphosphonates. So bisphosphonates, they're the ones which are most commonly used are the alendronate, risedronate, zoledronate, and another one is the ibandronate, which is given as a monthly drug. Pamidronate is another medicine. It is not recommended for osteoporosis. It is used mostly by rheumatologists for certain rheumatological problems. So this is something which is not in osteoporosis. So before you start bisphosphonates, important things which you need to know is that the creatinine clearance cannot be less than 35 ml per minute per 1.73 meter square area. And in risedronate, it cannot be less than 30 because they are renal toxic and they also have a renal metabolism. So you cannot give in renal compromised situation. Now, the newer drug denosumab has an advantage that you can give it in a creatinine clearance of between 15 to 30 ml, which is sort of stage 4 CKD. You can still give it in that, but stage 1 to 3 CKD, bisphosphonates can be given with very close supervisions and all for treatment of osteoporosis. In CKD stage 5, there is no guideline as to what you should treat and what you should not treat, because it is believed that treating CKD 5 stage osteoporosis will cause more harm than doing good. And other thing is that the vitamin D before you start anti-resorptive should be normal. So people who have GI issues and all, malabsorption syndromes and all, even bisphosphonates haven't given in those. But we have to understand that bisphosphonates are very less absorbed in body. So less than 1% of the dose of an alendronate 70 milligram, what you take by mouth, is absorbed. So that is why you give them very specifically. You give them early morning, you give them with a full glass of water, because you don't want the tablet to sort of get stuck into the esophagus. It sort of, once it dissociates, it can cause irritation and sometimes ulceration also. And you don't let the patient sleep in one place. So patient has to sit, move around, that he can do. And preferably, it should be 2 hours fasting after that, but minimum 45 minutes of not eating anything after, not drinking anything after the tablet is recommended to improve the absorption. Now, the drugs can be used in a preventive mode when you are starting steroids or anything, or in the treatment. Now, alendronate dosage and all we know, and zoledronate, we know that it's given 5 milligram once yearly, and intravenous for prevention is given as 5 milligram every 2 years. These are not for the oncological doses, because oncologists and those those specialties, they tend to use in very high dose. They give monthly 4 milligram and all. So that is something which we are not concerned about. We are talking about routine postmenopausal or senile osteoporosis. Now see this chart. You understand that alendronate, which is the most common medicine which we use, is not recommended for prevention of glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. Rather, a risedronate is a better drug. Then ibandronate is not recommended in giving in men, especially in glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. So we have to understand these two limitations, that for prevention of GIO, glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis, alendronate is not recommended, and neither is ibandronate. So you have to choose between risedronate and zoledronate. And again, understand that among all of these, the zoledronate is the one which has got best effect on preventing hip fractures. The alendronate has some effect, but it is not as good. Ibandronate and risedronate probably have very poor hip sort of preserving fractures. So if you are giving a spinal patient an anti-osteoporotic, you can still give alendronate and it will work for him. But if the patient has a hip fracture and you are giving sort of anti-resorptives, then probably zoledronate acid will have the best result, and then followed by an alendronate. Again, this is the same diagram which shows that alendronate, risedronate, ibandronate, they have got very poor effect on hip and wrists, and zoledronate has got effect on all. So this is probably the best available thing what you can do. And risedronate has got some effect on wrist, but probably this is not very well known. So if you have a patient who has got primarily osteoporosis of wrist and you are giving alendronate, so we don't expect a very significant improvement in that. So your drug has to be chosen as to what best will serve the purpose. And understand, we are not so concerned about wrist fractures as we are concerned about spine and hip fractures, because wrist is associated with sort of more a disability and a hand function, whereas spine and hip fractures are associated with mortality, especially the hip fracture. So that is why choosing the right drug is very important. So again, bisphosphonates have been recommended that if any patient who's gonna go for prednisolone more than 5 milligram per day for 3 months, and their T-score is in the osteopenia range, then you have to start them prophylactically on bisphosphonate. You don't think twice, you start them as soon as you start on steroids. Whereas other British Rheumatological Society says that anybody who is above 65 and you're thinking of starting steroids, just start them on bisphosphonates. So tomorrow you you may have to be in a situation where you don't have a rheumatologist, and primarily many orthopedic surgeons, they treat RA and all of those themselves. Then we should be aware that we have to look into the preventive effect of osteoporosis also whenever we are giving steroids. Now, there are specific side effects which we all should know, especially for the exam perspective with these drugs. Now, zoledronate can cause hypocalcemia. As I said earlier, that all of these situations, vitamin D should be normal before you give any of these drugs, because if patient is deficient in vitamin D, the only way the blood will have calcium is that it will dissolve the bone by osteoclastic activity to get calcium into the blood. If you block it by giving zoledronate, the blood will not have any option and it will go into hypocalcemia. And we have seen patients who have developed seizures because of hypocalcemia, severe hypocalcemia, and these situations have happened. It can give a flu-like reaction, sort of body aches, myalgias and all, especially it happens after first injection and subsequently it decreases. So to cover that, you may need to give oral paracetamol or mild NSAID for a couple of days or 3 days whenever you give zoledronic acid. Now, another important term which we should all be aware about is the BRONJ, or the bisphosphonate related osteonecrosis of jaw. So it is basically a non-healing ulcer which presents on the sort of gums or on the teeth, and it has a myofascial, it can have a myofascial involvement. The bone may be exposed, and there are specific definitions for this osteonecrosis of jaw. It has a necrotic bone in the maxillofacial area for at least 8 weeks in a patient receiving an anti-resorptive medicine, or other bone cancer medicines and other this thing. And this is what you need to be very careful about. So the incidence is around 0.7 per 1 lakh persons per year. It is more common with IV bisphosphonates. Multiple myeloma, best CAs who have IV bisphosphonate therapy, they are more prone to have these complications. It is believed to be triggered by a trauma to the dentoalveolar structure. And people who are on bisphosphonate, they need to go, whoever needs to go a dental procedure, you may get a call from the dentist asking specifically that I am taking your so-and-so patient and he's on bisphosphonate. So probably what you can recommend is that you can recommend a longer course of antibiotics for them, at least 7 to 10 days of antibiotics after they have done any dental procedure. The symptoms of ONJ or the BRONJ may be pain and swelling in the area. There may be cellulitis, bad breath or difficulty in opening in the mouth are also symptoms. And on examination, there may be an oral cutaneous fistula also. There may be infection, which is very severe. So in these cases, then surgery is needed. So normally medical management is recommended if there is antimicrobial rinses, sometimes systemic antibiotics, antifungals are given. The discontinuation of bisphosphonate therapy is done, and no dental therapy or minimal invasive dental therapy, that is root canal therapy instead of extraction and all, can be tried to prevent forming an open area onto the dental surface. And this is a type 3 very bad sort of stage 3 ONJ, where you need to do a surgical intervention, debridement and all, and we don't know whether it will heal or not. So if somebody has a sort of osteonecrosis of jaw, it takes around 3 to 6 months to sort of get healed. You have to counsel them that if this has happened, it's very rare, but it will take 3 to 6 months. And if the patient has been on sort of therapy, then it may take up to 12 months also. So this is the timeline you have to understand that it will take. The other important complication is a atypical subtrochanteric fracture. So it is a sort of a subtrochanteric fracture or a stress fracture which develops in the subtrochanteric area and can break with minimal trauma. The incidence is very, very less, like 0.07 per 10,000 person years. But again, it increases to sort of with the time. So risk after 2 years becomes 10 times more. Risk after 5 years becomes 50 times more. So that is what we have to understand, that as we increase the therapy of bisphosphonate, these complications can also increase. There are other risk factors also, like inadequate response of PTH to hypocalcemia and obesity, early menopause and younger age. They have been linked with increased sort of risk factors for subtrochanteric fractures. So that is why optimizing the bisphosphonate therapy is important. After 3 to 5 years, you should plan a drug holiday. And then these also, bisphosphonates have a memory effect, like other teriparatide, denosumab, they sort of stay there for 1 to 2 years. So they don't sort of suddenly drop. That is the best advantage of bisphosphonates, that they have a memory effect. It doesn't go away suddenly. It stays there for some time. So after 3 to 5 years, you should plan a drug holiday. And there are specific guidelines that if you have to continue, you may continue bisphosphonates whenever there are certain risk factors. So if the patient's T-score is minus 2.0 and there are no other major risk factors, you can discontinue the therapy. But if the T-score is still less, you may plan to continue, considering that this may lead to the complications. But now we have to take a call because the patient's fragility is more important. So if you get an atypical subtrochanteric fracture, the first is that you have to discontinue the therapy. You need to give adequate calcium and vitamin D and give teriparatide. If you have a patient of atypical femoral fracture, if it is asymptomatic and it's partial, you can do MRI surveillance and then minimal weight bearing till MRI shows no edema and follow it up. But if it's a symptomatic incomplete fracture, or if it is a complete fracture, then you have to fix it with an intramedullary nailing. Now let's come to the other drug, which is the denosumab. It is a newer drug which we are dealing with. It's basically a monoclonal antibody against the rank ligand. So how does a sort of osteoclast work? Is that osteoclast has a rank receptor on its surface, and it binds the rank ligand, which is shown by this orange ball. And once it binds, it activates into a osteoclast and starts resorbing the bone. Now, what RAC ligand does is that it takes away this receptor, it takes away this rank, and it binds it rank and does not let it sit on the rank receptor and transform into a osteoclast. So this is the way a denosumab works. The current scenario is that it has been approved for use up to 10 years. It is renal friendly, as we discussed, but there is slightly increased hypocalcemia risk. We need to be more coercive. Vitamin D should be optimal, and we need to give adequate supplementation. It is cleared by reticuloendothelial system, but there are increased risk for certain skin infections and all. And we do not have a full answer to what to do after these 10 years or after 5 years, should we switch the therapy or not. Now, this is the diagram of various doses which were given. And as we can see, the one which we use is this one, which is 60 milligram per 6 months. And it usually stays there till 6 months. That is why it's very essential to give this denosumab regularly at 6 months. You can give it a couple of days early or 5 days early, but you should not go beyond 6 months and delay it further, because then the effect gets washed away. So there is a slight concern that when you stop denosumab, suddenly there is an increase in serum CTX, which means there is an increase in serum catabolism. That is why you have to be very careful that you need to follow these patients and don't let them sort of drip. So this is a diagram which shows that as the denosumab is given, the bone density is increasing. And then when you discontinue, it suddenly dips. Although it is still it is better than what it would be if you were giving placebo, means you are not treating anything, but still there is a dip, and it sort of comes again if you start retreatment with that. Now, this is something what they say is that if you stop at 24 months, it starts increasing. The bone density starts decreasing between 24 to 36, and the markers settle around 4 years. So there were many trials which, even if you know the name, the DEFEND, the DECIDE, the STAND, and FREEDOM, these are the main trials which will be discussed in any sort of osteoporotic meeting. So DEFEND was the first trial which just wanted to prove that denosumab improves the bone density. Then they took a trial was DECIDE, where they compared it with alendronate and found that denosumab has got better effect than alendronate. And then there was a study where they sort of thought that the people who are going already on alendronate, and then let's see sort of if we switch them over to denosumab, does it give better effect? So again, the answer was yes. People who are on alendronates, if you switch them to denosumab, their bone density improves significantly. And then there was a last major trial, which was the FREEDOM trial, in which there was a placebo group as well as a denosumab group, wherein they showed that denosumab is much better in reducing the fracture and all in these subgroup of patients. So we'll not go into the details of these trials because they are slightly too detailed to go into. But let's have a look at this trial, which was from the FREEDOM study. So FREEDOM was initially a trial which was meant for sort of 2 years or 3 years, and then it was given an extension. So what happened in this was, this blue is the denosumab group, this green is the placebo group, and then this dark blue is the denosumab group again. So what they did is they had a control group, which is the placebo group, and then they had a denosumab group. And they found that the denosumab, the bone density was much better as compared to a placebo group. But what would happen if you give denosumab to placebo group at the end of this time, which is 3 years? So they found that giving the denosumab to them also improves their bone density. So these diagrams all show that denosumab is much better than a placebo in improving the bone density. So coming on to the adverse effects of these denosumab, there are mainly the skin infections, which were considered as serious infections, including cellulitis and erysipelas, which sort of could happen anywhere after any time, anywhere after the injection. And they were ones which were quite significant and statistically quite strongly correlating with it. But most of them settled with the medical management. Now, again, this is a sort of a graph which is showing that even in the people who have creatinine clearance of 15 to 29, which is not recommended for the bisphosphonate group, the denosumab sort of helps in improving the incidence of fractures. So they are much, much better in these age groups. As I said, in stage 4, stage 5 CKD, it is no anti-osteoporotic is recommended. Now, there is a specific problem with denosumab is that because once you stop them, the bone density suddenly stops dripping. So there is a increased incidence of fractures after you suddenly stop denosumab after a period of time whenever you have given them. So it is still under study. Some have reduced this to increased vertebral fractures with multiple fractures and all. So probably what is recommended is that you should not stop the denosumab immediately. You probably switch them over to bisphosphonate for a year and then sort of wean them off. And we have to be sure that drug holidays, as we give in bisphosphonate, cannot be safely initiated in denosumab. You have to switch them over to bisphosphonate and then sort of take a decision further that what you want to do and closely monitor these patients. And denosumab now is also approved for glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. It was approved in 2008 by FDA, and in January 2021 this year, it is now also approved in India. But this is primarily for the treatment of GIOP, not for prevention. For prevention, still, I believe bisphosphonates are the best medicines. Now, anabolic agents are many. We are going to talk about by default, you should know about the strontium. Strontium is the next periodic sort of element in the calcium group, and it has got the same sort of electronic configuration as calcium. So it was given as an anabolic agent, and it had got very promising results, but then it fell later out of the market, probably because of myocardial infarction risk and other problems. And we know most of the people, we do not use this medicine. The gold standard for today is the teriparatide, which we use in the anabolic activity. It is recommended up to 24 months. It is recommended as a once in a lifetime therapy, daily 20 milligrams subcutaneous as a self-administered injection. There were concerns of malignancy in animal models, but they were in the growing rats. It could cause an increased incidence of osteosarcoma in the growing rats. But there were two issues. One is that they were rats, they were not humans. And second, they had open growth plates, which we do not use teriparatide in kids. So probably there is a concern. So if somebody has a history of any osteosarcoma or anything, then definitely you're not going to do it. If you want to be more precautious, avoid it in any type of malignancy and all as such. So for monitoring the teriparatide, we sort of check the P1NP. So I told you about the bone turnover markers. The CTX was the catabolic and P1NP was the anabolic marker. So you take a baseline and then you have 3 months P1NP after teriparatide. It should help you. You should monitor serum calcium on teriparatide because sometimes it can cause hypercalcemia. If it causes, you have to reduce the sort of calcium dosage and then reassess. Again, precautions. If you ask for a calcium and somebody has applied a tight tourniquet and he has beaten the hell out of the vein before drawing a sample, you expect that it's anyways going to be hypercalcemic sample. So it doesn't represent. So that's why you need to be very precautious in these situations and use a ionized calcium or an albumin correction for the best result. And teriparatide is recommended for all. It's recommended for postmenopausal, senile, as well as glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. Now, we studied all of these drugs in single. Is there a way to combine the therapy? So there was a study which has been done, which is called as a data study. So denosumab and teriparatide. So what they did is they did study for 2 years and then extended for another 2 years. They gave teriparatide, and then those people who were given teriparatide, they switched to denosumab. Then people who were given denosumab, they gave teriparatide, and then who were received both, they continued it with denosumab. So the results of the study were that if you give both and follow it up with denosumab, you get the best result. If you give teriparatide and follow it up with denosumab, that's also good. But if you're giving denosumab first and then teriparatide, it does not help you because you are sort of, you'll get peeled off by both ways. It's not going to help you much. So these are the same sort of diagrams from the study. You can see the green line is sort of at the top of all of these, which shows that the combination of the therapy is much, much better than an individual therapy. But usually we reserve these for very, very severe osteoporosis where we are trying desperately to try everything. Otherwise, a single drug therapy is what is recommended as per what you decide based on the patient profile. There are other anabolic agents which are sort of into the coming into the way. Teriparatide has also got a newer drug called abloparatide, which is also coming. It's started to use in USA, and both of these drugs in combination have still a capping of 2 years. But in India, teriparatide is the one which is freely available, and that is what we stick to. So the take-home message from today's talk is that prevention is better than cure. We need to identify the target population early. We need to understand the people at risk, what disease we are dealing with. Are we dealing with a glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis, or we are dealing with post-menopausal osteoporosis, or we are dealing with a senile osteoporosis? Is there a concomitant fracture which is there? So all of these considerations need to be taken. Where is the fracture? Is it spinal? Is it hip? What we are trying to achieve? Are we trying to sort of prevent a resorption? Or we are trying to sort of promote bone healing? All of these considerations need to be taken into account once you prescribe a drug to the patient. And custom-made treatment, as I said, is the key. And the most important is that you have to counsel the patient and ensure that they comply. Otherwise, the whole result will be poor. Thank you very much.